Yeah, I've been asked to talk a little bit about what institutions are and how we can come to understand them better. I think this is a lecture that's primarily designed for people in technical fields like engineering. And it's the kind of thing that you probably don't spend a lot of time talking about and thinking about. But my purpose today is to try to get you to realize that it in fact is an interesting subject and one that is going to have a good bit of impact on your work, whether you realize it now or not. I'm a sociologist, and one of the things we emphasize is the importance of context, the importance of the wider arena within which all kinds of action occurs. And there are many kinds of contexts or environments out there that we share together. One's the physical environment, things like water and atmosphere and minerals. We know about that pretty well and we experience it every day. There's the biological environment with things like plants and animals. There's also, particularly important for engineers and for technical groups, there's what we call the built physical environment, the kind of improvements we make in our environment to make life more pleasant and more useful for a variety of purposes. We built bridges and houses and dams and roads and so on. But there's also a constructed social environment. And I think this is the realm of the social scientist. And we're interested in the way in which, over time, interaction between people working together create a social environment. We create things like religions, we create kinship structures, we create more advanced worlds, we create professional cultures, and these are systems that are built and maintained and have enormous effect on our everyday life. So this slide asks, why would the constructed social environment be important to engineers? Well, the kind of buildings and the kind of bridges and the kind of highways we built are embedded within and surrounded by and interdependent with the constructed social environment. And these environments present engineers with both contradictions and conflicts, as well as resources and opportunities. For example, if you're trying to build a highway system in an urban area, you are going to run into different groups that have ideas about where that facility should sit and how it should be located. And you're going to find that there are lots of groups that are somewhat contentious about that and begin to have opinions about that. But you're also going to find groups that you can develop alliances with and groups that you can work together to try to improve provide a solution for them that will be a win-win for the groups involved. So they provide both conflicts as well as opportunities. When I talk about the constructed social environment, a particularly important part of that are what the sociologists call institutions. Now, institutions is a very broad, general, vague term, and we use it all the time. We talk about, we think about maybe the law as an institution, or we think about churches as institutions, or a lot of people think about the state as an important kind of institution. These are all correct answers. They're all correct, because there are lots of kinds of institutional arrangements that have been constructed over time by people like us and by people that came before us. Institutions are those parts of the socially constructed environment that are relatively enduring and relatively stable over time. Relatively. No social structure is completely stable or without conflict and change, but these are relatively stable. So that, for example, if we begin to interact on a playground with other people and we create little sort of systems and we create perhaps temporary teams or alliances and so on, those are here for one moment, and when the game breaks up, they're gone. But we also put in place things like family systems or organizations And these systems are intended and designed to be relatively long-lived. And so if you're a member of an organization and you leave the organization in the evening and you come back in the day, and suddenly those stable interactions and those relations and those expectations are still there, and you re-enter back into them. So the institutions refer to those more stable and repeated and enduring aspects of the social environment. Institutions are both social in the sense that they're made up of the activities of people and the relationships that develop between people, but they're also cultural in the sense that they engage the symbolic systems that we create together. They create they're surrounded by meaning systems that we have constructed, and usually that are maintained and communicated by language. Language itself is an institution that is used to create larger frameworks of meaning and of stability. So I'm going to try to expand on this idea, but they're both the social and the cultural, but it's also, these are things that they're connected to actual ongoing activities and actual ongoing resources that are valued by the people involved. So they're not these sort of ephemeral, disconnected worlds, but they are connected to actual activities, actual work, actual play, resources, energy, valued resources of all kinds. And so institutions bring these together and provide a kind of a continuity and stability in all these aspects. If you look at the social science literature on institutions, you'll find that there are a huge number of approaches to perspectives on definitions of what an institution is. And one of the things, I'm a kind of a synthetic guy, and one of the things that I've tried to do is to say, what are the kinds of elements that we can put together that will borrow from the ideas of a variety of kinds of social scientists, from the political scientists, from the economists, from the psychologists, and so on, to capture some sense of what we mean by an institution. And so I've constructed this framework that's called the Pillars Framework, and talks about sort of three basic types of ingredients or elements that go into a socially constructed system that is somewhat enduring and somewhat stable. And there are three ingredients. The regulative, these are things like rules and regulations and laws and governance systems. If you ask most economists what an institution is, they'll talk about the state, they'll talk about legal frameworks, they'll talk about very explicit and precise agreements between people about how things are to be done and who's to do them. And that's a perfectly good definition. It's an aspect and an important aspect of institutions. And so we want to recognize the importance of these regulatory structures, which are really quite fundamental, particularly to the more secular and modern social structures. They're particularly characterized by these. Most of the specialized worlds that we live in, the organization worlds, there are rules, worlds of rules and frameworks and so on, the governance structures that we've created, these are all aspects of contemporary civilization. They particularly emphasize the more formal and the more regulative aspects of these frameworks. But they're also, and these are ones, this is the elements that sociologists emphasize, institutions are also normative frameworks. Norms include values, they include expectations about what I'm supposed to do in this situation, what you're supposed to do in this situation. They include roles, who does what, when in this situation, and how do we understand that. They include conventions. They include practices, they include routines, they include protocols, traditions. They're all these somewhat more informal, somewhat vaguer, but very robust sets of expectations that really provide some guidance for us as we move into and through these different social worlds. And so there are the normative systems, particularly emphasized by sociologists, people like me. And then third, there is another set, I think too long underemphasized and unrecognized by most social scientists, but long emphasized by anthropologists, that says that the real foundation of order, particularly in the more traditional societies, which they've studied, the pre-modern groups that they've specialized in, these groups are mostly controlled not so much by rules, but by a set of shared understandings. This is the world we live in. This is the way we do these things. And they are belief systems, they are mental systems, in the sense mental models that provide you with guidelines for what do you do in this situation. They are cognitive templates, categories and distinctions between different kinds of situations. So you have the clean versus the unclean, the sacred versus the secular. These kind of distinctions are very important. And so the anthropologists and the cognitive psychologists are the ones to emphasize that a lot of the order in this world is not produced so much by things that our expectations we have, but by things we understand and believe. This is the way the world is. Not how I'm supposed to behave, but this is the nature of the world. So you have the cultural, cognitive, and I use that hyphenated word because cultures always are shared belief systems shared by a set of people outside yourself. And so it's a widely shared set of beliefs, but they're also internalized beliefs. And so they provide a cognitive map for how I behave in this situation. Well-known organization student has talked about these kinds of systems as the software of the mind. Cultures provide the software of the mind. They're the system that controls how we behave in different situations, whether other people are present or not. And so as the slide indicates, these three elements, the regulative, the normative, and the cultural cognitive, are different kinds of ingredients, each of which provides a very strong pillar around which different kinds of institutional frameworks are built. It's also true that robust institutions, the ones that have the strongest stability and the best enduring power, are the ones in which the pillars are relatively aligned. The rules are supported by the norms, and the norms are reinforced by a set of shared belief systems. These are the stronger elements. And almost always, the change that goes on in any kind of constructed social environment is change that's created by tensions between or maladaptations between the rules or the beliefs or the expectations. And so that's a source of an enormous amount of change and ferment and contradiction and conflict. As the slide also indicates, these systems move from the more formally explicit, written down, codified systems to the ones that are much more tacit, taken for granted, understood, unspoken. And there's also, it seems like, a sort of a sense in which these are layered systems. And so you cannot have rules unless there are things that are commonly recognized about which you can have a rule. So some of the most important cognitive dimensions are what are called the constitutive symbols. The constitutive symbols are about, let's take the simple example of a game, and let's say we're going to have a game, and the game is to move this object, and this object becomes a round ball or an oblong ball like a football. There's a ball, a football, that is a constituted cognitive category, a football, that is to be kicked or passed from one goal post to another. And a goal post are pillars indicating the end of the field, the location where you have to cross in order to make a score. And so all these distinctions, the football, the referees, the first downs, the timeouts, all these things are constituted categories around which we build norms and rules. And so in many ways, as I started to say, these elements are nested in the sense that you've got to have a basic set of beliefs, particularly constitutive categories of things, in order to have norms or expectations, and you have to have them in order to have rules or laws. And so these are really, you can't have just a system of regulatory a regulatory framework. It has to be a set of rules about something, and that something are the cultural cognitive materials that we talked about. Okay, let me just say a couple more things about these pillars. The pillars have there's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot going on in these systems. They differ in many ways in terms of, what's the basis of compliance? Why are we agreeing to act in certain predictable ways? Well, in the case of regulative, it often, the basic reason for complying is because of expedience. If you don't do this, you'll be fined. If you don't do this, you'll be arrested. If there's an infraction of some kind, it's followed by some kind of sanction. And so sort of a rational set of a mindset among people says, well, I better do this, or this bad thing is going to happen to, or I should do this because these good things, I'll be rewarded for doing these kinds. So that's one kind of basis. The normative, the basis of compliance is much more a sense of what is my position in this set of relationships? What are my obligations to the other people in the situation? What are the expectations that I have how other people will behave? And it's much more a matter of shared understandings, obligations, expectations. Whereas the cognitive, why do you behave? Why do you conform in these situations? Well, that's just what you're supposed to do. That's the way this is. It's taken for granted. It's completely built in. It's baked into the cake. And so in an audience like this, why are you sitting here trying to understand what I'm talking about? Well, that's the role of the audience member. And for lecturers, why am I giving a lecture that I've given before and probably will give again sometime? Because that's what lecturers do. They try to explain things they understand to help other people understand those things. And so we're here all acting out of, I don't think you're complying because you're going to be penalized or you're going to be hurt in some way if you were to leave the lecture, but you're listening because you have a little sense of obligation about, well, I'm a student and that's the way students behave. But there's also this broader taken for granted understanding about what is the situation? What's the nature of the situation? What's my understanding about how I should behave in this situation? It's enormously powerful. I remember I was giving lectures way back in the university during the time of the Vietnam period and the time of the tremendous amount of student rebellion on campus. And I remember I was in one of the worst quarters of my teaching career. I'd stand up and sort of begin to talk about organizations or some aspect of organizations. And the students would say, yeah, well, what does this have to do with the war in Vietnam? And my response was, maybe nothing immediate and direct at this point, but it has a lot to do in terms of the way in which those kind of activities get started, the way in which they continue. And so it gives you a basic vocabulary and a set of understandings for understanding situations like this, for talking about things like this. Well, that's not going to bring peace in Vietnam. And so, many of them just at that point said, I've had enough and leave, It's not going to solve the immediate problem, so I can't stand it. Well, that for me, I thought it was the end of the university world at that point. I never thought we would ever come back together to that kind of world again. Turned out we had summer break and fall quarter came back, and all of a sudden people remembered why it was they wanted to be at a university. They remember what a student role was. They remember why professors were there. And in the fall quarter, after the spring quarter when Stanford was disrupted and the whole system broke, Stanford came back. And it was as though virtually nothing had happened. The enduring power of institutions was never more strongly impressed on my mind than at that time. I indicated at the beginning that one of the things I'm trying to do is to provide you with some vocabulary for talking about these pretty interesting and complex systems. And if you only pick up one word today, my candidate for you would be the word on the slide, structuration. It's one of my favorite words. It's a word coined by a relatively well-known social scientist, Anthony Giddens, I guess Cambridge. Giddens, like many others, but he was able to develop the idea. Like many others, Giddens pointed out that structures don't exist. They really are much more accurately described as a process of ongoing continuation. And so structures only exist in the sense that they're continually reproduced or maintained over time. And so structuration is, he thought, or structuring, is a better word for talking about structures than, he thinks we ought to shift to verbs, from nouns to verbs, to think about structuration. And specifically, social structures are patterned social activities and relations that are moving across time. And he also has this notion of what he calls the duality of structure or structuring. And that is that the structures that we have are both the platform out of which our current actions arise, but they are also the product of those actions at the next point in time. And so if I had a blackboard here, they've done away with blackboards in this world, but if you think about structure up here and actors down here, and then you develop an arrow from here and it says structure. Okay, you've got structures that are pre-existing structures, and they are influencing all the actions that occur within that specific structure. They're influencing, they provide the environment for and the context for that action. But then the actors down here are choosing either to reproduce that structure, to keep it going, to kick the ball down the road a little ways, or to modify, to change, to disrupt, to improve. And so social behavior is a constant reiteration of, we're in this structure now, which we are maintaining and reproducing and changing and disrupting over time. And so the only way in which the worlds that we live in continue to exist is that we continue to recreate them every day. What's a family? Well, it's groups of related people coming together around meals, around common tasks, and so on. When they begin to cease doing that, where is that structure? Where is it? It's just gone. Classrooms, if you don't come back together in a classroom, if the lecture doesn't happen, if the students aren't attending, where's that classroom? It's gone. And so one of the things that it reminds us of is the enormous vulnerability of these fundamental structures that we think of as being so solid and so predictable and so taken for granted. They are only that insofar as people continue to believe in them, they continue to follow the obligations that they have, not just the rights of these organizations, but the responsibilities that people have, and they continue to follow and reproduce the rules. Only in those cases do you have an ongoing sense of an institution. And for those of us that are living in today's democracies, we realize that these are situations that we cannot take for granted. If they're going to be here tomorrow, it's because we're going to follow, reproduce, improve, recreate, continue the beliefs, the practices, the shared obligations that we have as citizens of a democracy. And so democracies are particularly vulnerable because they depend very much on citizen buy-in and citizen participation. And so it's a reminder about the subject that we all realize is so important, that we all take for granted, is in fact a very vulnerable and fragile structure. So how are institutions constructed? Well, there are two broad ways in which this process goes on, I think. On the one hand, and this is what's called a naturalistic account, and these are the ones that are present in more informal and more organic kinds of systems. And they're the result of just sort of informal, undirected processes. People begin to come together in different contexts, in different situations. They begin to create a set of ongoing routines and activities and ordered relationships and so on. And then they either disappear and go out go on their way and you fold into a new situation, or people begin to invest more in them and they begin to become more stable over time. And so the more informal structures are the ones that we create every day in our workplace, in our classrooms, in our, every formal structure is filled with all kinds of informal arrangements that are created and recreated over time by specific actions among specific occupants as they go through the business of getting through the day. So these are the naturalistic accounts. These are the ones, of course, that the sociologists emphasize. These are the kinds of things that we think this is the real meat of social structures. But of course, there are economists and political scientists saying, no. The more important ones, the real big boy ones, are the ones that are designed and created by rational people who are saying if we want to do this, then this is the right way to do it, and this is what you do, and this is what I do, and we do this, and we meet on this. And so it's very self-conscious, very relational. Very self-conscious pursuit of a common set of interests. Which of these is the correct process? They're both going on. They're both going on all the time. In a modern society, the rational-based accounts are much more common, much more reoccurring than they were in earlier times. More and more, even many aspects of our civil society, our sort of more informal aspects, are being constructed in more rational ways. And so informal groups get more formally organized. If we're going to be serious, we have to get organized. We have to create a chair, a vice chair, a secretary, have to keep minutes, have to have records. If you're going to be really serious, you do all this stuff. And so these sort of rational accounts are very contagious and they spread through the environment, but they are still always supported by, always coexisting with a set of ongoing, much more informal, spontaneous, changing, flexible accounts. Otherwise, I think the structures wouldn't be here. Another useful concept that I think we in the organizations world talk about is that of an organizational field. And what this concept does is simply remind us that when we talk about societies, or when we talk about social structures, or some big things like this, they're pretty vague and amorphous and hard to get your head around. And so, for most purposes, it helps to think about more circumscribed kinds of social units. And in a complex society like ours, it is really a mosaic of multiple organization fields, each of these little islands of order that are sort of coexisting, nested against each other, ongoing through time. And sort of there's the world of professional theater, there's the world of various types of industries, there's the world of organized sports, there's the world of politics, there's the world of legal frameworks and legal representatives. All these worlds are out there, and each of them are delimited social orders, somewhat circumscribed, all of them interdependent with each other, but also somewhat independent of each other, coexisting over time. And these fields, you can identify them at huge mega levels. You can think about societal sectors, as I just mentioned, all of organized sports, or all of the professional service arenas. Or you can think about an organization field in your hometown, a set of community-based organizations, or a set of service clubs, or a set of sports teams, and you can move up and down. And so there are all these different levels or layers at which institutional structures emerge. And we have to keep in mind that these institutions exist at different levels. And so I've included here the notion of the policy arena. People, the opioid drug crisis, the mental health problems. There are particular areas in which you have a set of people that are victimized or the participants in this system. You have a set of people that are professionals attending to it. You have a set of regulatory people. You have a set of interest groups around that. You can think about a policy arena. They're all markets for different products are all that can be viewed and thought of as organization field. There are supply chains of various kinds that cross national boundaries. And then it goes on and on. You have cultures, nation states, state religious governments, sector governments arrangements, trade associations. These are all different ways in which one can begin to identify a set of social frameworks associated with a set of activities, associated with a set of practices, associated with a set of beliefs. And it goes on. Occupations, communities, projects. I think project groups are particularly, for our engineers, at least the groups that I work with, particularly kind of a really interesting organization field. Almost always they're temporary systems. Almost always you have a set of people, a set of sort of development and visionary people who try to put together a framework that would support the creation of some kind of project, and then they have to begin to mobilize a set of people that would be appropriate to carrying that out. All that occurs within a regulatory framework that is increasingly world system frameworks, national system frameworks, state frameworks, local frameworks. All that is going to impact it. And then, of course, you bring together occupations from all kinds of different specialty groups, the electricians, the plumbers, the heating system people, the architects, the lawyers. All these groups come together, and you have this extraordinarily complex, varied mosaic of these groups that come together to create a bridge, a highway, an airport, a specific kind of project system. And institutional ideas and arguments can help you unpack that extraordinarily complex world, or where are the missing pieces, or who's likely to come in conflict with who do we need to get on board, who do we need to inform before we do these things. These are all frameworks that we can use to think about the problems of managing the ongoing life of a project. Speaking of ongoing life, my colleagues here at Stanford, including Ray Levitt, and I think one of the lead graduate students involved in this was Andrew South, have done some really interesting work talking about the different phases of project groups and the way in which the composition and the composition of these groups varies over time. And so you have the identification phase where the sponsors and developers begin to come together and begin to develop the basic core of an idea. And then they have to begin to find some sponsors and other people that are going to provide the money and the resources to go forward with these things. And then if they are able to go forward, they need to put together a set of architects and designers to say, okay, we're going to do this in this way with these materials. And then you need to begin to assemble a set of construction people that are going to actually build and construct the facility. And then finally, you need people that are going to actually operate, maintain, and be sure the system continues over time for the life of the project. And increasingly in many of these projects, the life of the project may be 50 years long or longer. It can be a very long time. And one of the things that South and Ray Levitt and others have pointed out is that each of these phases brings together and highlights a different set of stakeholders, a different set of people who are going to actually be doing the work and are the ones that have ownership of and the interest in doing this. And these stakeholders are hugely varied in number and in interests, in the kind of language they use, the kind of understandings they have about their role. And they vary dramatically as the project moves from identification through construction and design to operation they vary enormously. And so one of the things that Andrew South and colleagues studied a toll road in Southern California and were able to show that less than 5% of the stakeholders were involved in all 4 phases of the design, and that more than 70% of the stakeholders, more than 70%, were only involved in one phase. And so one of the kinds of problems that those kind of facts entail for those that want to design the governance arrangements, how we're going to build a structure that will govern and really manage this whole process. One of the huge problems that these groups confront is the problem that Levitt and others have defined as the problem of displaced agency. To be an agent, to have agency, is to have power to control decisions that affect your interest. But what happens if you, as an agent whose interests are involved, are not even present at the time the decisions that affect your interests are made? You're not even represented. It's a problem of displaced or broken agency in which your interests are at stake but are not represented. And so the question is, how do you design governance groups that will do that? One of many challenges, I think, that engineers face that will be enormously aided by thinking about the problems of the different institutional orders that come together in a project space. And so today, in the few minutes we spent together, I've tried to talk about sort of 3 different ideas about, well, actually 4 different ideas about institutions as an important concept to understand better. First of all, institutions are many things. They're many things. They're made up of many ingredients, many elements. And you need to understand what kind of institution are you talking about. Is it a legal framework? Is it a set of customs and understandings? Is it a primarily set of expectations that are shared by the groups? And so many of the groups that are involved in construction projects, like the craft groups, like the professional groups, are really structures that are structured largely around a set of shared beliefs and a set of shared practices. It's not about rules. It's about who are we? What kind of work do we do? How do we know how to do it? What's a good solution to this problem? These are shared understandings among this set of people. So they're insight number 1. There are many different types of institutional elements that enter into an institutional framework. That's a problem. It makes them complex. It's an advantage. There are so many different possible levers to try, to change, to improve, to be aware of. There's so many different facets that this isn't going right. Why not? What can we do? How do you intervene? There's not one intervention. There are many possible. So it gives you a set of diagnostic tools for looking at this. Many ingredients. Okay. These institutional structures operate at multiple levels. The project in Southern California, the toll road, is affected by developments perhaps at the world system level. Maybe there are international banking rules that get involved because of the people that are supplying the money. Oversight groups of various kinds. They clearly are subject to a set of constraints that come from national, state, local bodies. In a more immediate way, they're affected by bringing together multiple professional groups, multiple types of workers, multiple types of interests. They almost always bring together the representatives from the public sector, from the private sector, from the nonprofit sector, all with different ideologies, different ideas, different frameworks. Institutions are not structures. They are structured activities, frameworks, relationships that are ongoing through time. At these levels, each of these levels have frameworks that are affecting. Each of them are changing at a different rate. Each of them are varying at a different speed. And you need to understand what kinds of groups are involved, at what stage are they. In some engineering projects, the industry is fairly mature. You've got a lot of people who understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're doing it. In other areas, you have lots of people who have no idea what you're doing, why you're doing it this way. One of the problems, my colleague Ray Levitt and I are working on public-private partnerships. And in this country, these are very immature frameworks. They're not well understood by the people that are involved. They're not well supported by national, state, or regional bodies. And so each of these things is sort of a lone reed out there that's moving in the wind, because they have no continuing source of expertise to call on. They are not, to coin a word, they are not mature institutional frameworks. They're not frameworks in which these arrangements have been sorted out, figured out, put together, so you could have some stability in that. So there are different ingredients involved, and there are different levels involved, and there are different timescales involved, and there's a change over time in what kind of participants are involved, or the identity of the people that are actually activated by the processes underway. And so I think by including in your kit bag of tools, by including more information about the nature of the constructed social environment within which you're working, by thinking about all the ways in which you can make that work for you instead of work against you, that would be, I think, a valuable thing, a valuable lesson for you to take home from this lecture. Hope it's been helpful. Thank you.
What happens when you bring together, say, participants from different countries that may have different languages, and you say language is the fundamental element of institutions? Some languages can't express some concepts, for example.
Yes.
Or different beliefs about individualism versus collectivism, or other dimensions.
I first got involved in this work when Professor Levitt invited me to join, because he was starting a center called the Center for Global Projects, and we were beginning to think about how projects are affected by international and by global operational parameters. And so the first work we did in that project was to emphasize the way in which, if you're spanning regions or areas of the country, you're also almost by definition moving into different kinds of political or regulatory frameworks. You're moving into different cultural frameworks, different languages, different religious groups, different belief systems. So very often the organization of professions varies a good bit from one society to another. The scope of an architect's role is different in France than it is in the United States, for example. It's important to understand those kind of things. If you're doing projects in third world countries, you clearly are spanning many different cultural systems, some of which all operate in the same geographical region, but they're different ethnic groups, there are different tribal groups, there are different class groups, there are different religious sects, and so on. So there's an enormous amount of cultural complexity that's introduced in those kind of ways, that's added to the usual kinds of work group differences, the differences between electricians and and lawyers and engineers, very different cultures. And the difference, of course, in legal and regulatory frameworks, the kind of support or the kind of way in which you interact with national governments may be very different in a totalitarian system or a more centralized system than it is in a more liberal democratic system. And so those all introduce additional dimensions for all of these arenas. So yes, it could be a genuine challenge. And of course, to quote the great social anthropologist Clifford Geertz, there is no substitute for local knowledge, for really understanding in depth, and for beginning to work with some expatriate people who've had more experience and have worked over time with those groups. They can be enormously valuable allies in this situation because they bring this most valuable resource is how are things done here, and why are they done that way, and who does those things? Very important to find that out. Yes.
Do you think these ideas apply to medicine, and that perhaps the most displaced agent of all is the patient?
Oh my goodness. I spent many years studying the world of healthcare in this world, and there are so many cultures and so many crazy distinctions that are made in that world about who can do what and who's allowed to do what. And the restrictions, particularly, that, for many years, the doctors were just a completely monopolistic group in terms of saying any decisions that are made, we make them. Any discretion that's fair there, we claim it for ourselves, and so on. And they did a very good job for a long time of really preventing a whole set of people with much more valuable hands-on experience that had much more useful knowledge about the state of the patient and what was really going on in that hospital room, for example. And they simply denied that knowledge existed and was of any use. And it's been a very slow and torturous process to begin to create some kind of more equality in that world, to begin to rely on teams as opposed to individual providers, to begin to, and then I haven't even mentioned, to actually think about and talk with and understand what the patient wants. There's so many things that these groups spend so little time. They worry about the biology and the chemistry. They forget about the sociology of these worlds. They really do. And it's to the detriment of the quality of their work and to the quality of care they provide. It's a genuine problem. It's not just engineers that can be opaque. I can tell you that. In fact, in my experience, engineers are more open to trying to hear about these ideas than most professional groups. Yes.
When talking about the challenges that the different phases of a construction project represent, and you mentioned only 5% of the stakeholders are involved throughout all these phases.
That was true in this one study. Yes. Yes.
So what do you see as a potential solution to having a more integrated approach to the projects and having people like the people that are going to be operating the projects involved from the beginning?
Yeah, I think you've sort of begun to frame the solution, and that is you need, as you think about these projects, you really need to begin to think about, well, what are the requirements at the operational stage and about these people who aren't even maybe recruited yet or yet represented? What are the kinds of concerns that they are going to have and that we could include in our design at this point? And you need to begin to, as soon as you can, begin to have consultation with, representation from, contact with these groups. And it's not just the people, the stakeholders that are, quote, inside stakeholders that are officially part of the process. They're also the external stakeholders, the ones that are affected by the project. And we very early on, as we looked at these infrastructure construction projects really realized that there were two fundamental phases of operation. There are the phase that before the project begins and it's designed on the one hand, and then phase two is when it actually begins to go into the ground. And all of a sudden, when you begin to see a building going up in your backyard or a highway going behind your house, all of a sudden a whole set of really important stakeholders suddenly says, "What do you mean you're doing this?" You know, it comes to their attention. And in order to avoid that kind of unexpected, it's unpredicted but completely predictable flare-up, you need to reach out ahead of time and to include those people that are going to be directly affected early on so that their concerns can be at least taken into account, not necessarily completely completely solved, but at least so that there's some attention to the most obvious ways in which this is going to be, for many people, a real cost and a burden as opposed to a resource and an asset. And so you need to, as always, we have colleagues who talk about, the most important phase of any project is the so-called shaping phase, the identification phase. And that's the one where you want to think as broadly as you can about, okay, this is what we're doing now, but think about this thing 50 years or 40 years from now. Who are the people that are really going to be affected and involved? And you need to begin to think in those terms very early on before those people ever appear at your door. So some forecasting, some awareness of this is going to have real, ongoing, lasting repercussions for a lot of people for a long time. And the more you can sort of take that into account in your planning and your hearings and your representation groups, the better off you'll be, and the better project you'll have. Okay, thank you all.